My guess is the BBC is going to have to settle this at a very high level and a very large amount of money, because they can't risk this going to Discovery, because if it goes to Discovery, it will surely, I suspect, and inevitably reveal that most BBC executives have an inherent anti-Trump bias.
It is now 25 to 11. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Later on, after 11, we're going to look at the subject of why government isn't working. An awful lot of complaints about the civil service and civil service complaints about the government. We'll speak to two people who are very familiar with that world. Ben Judah, who until last month was a special advisor to David Lammy, and Max Blaine, who was in government for 3 prime ministers. But for now, of course, let's talk a little bit about the interface between the media and politics. President Trump is taking on the media. The Washington Post has apparently been gutted to please him by Jeff Bezos. The president, of course, has also sued multiple publications, including the BBC, for $10 billion. Well, one man in some ways who knows what it's like being caught in the middle is the former editor of British national newspapers. Now, I don't know how he would describe himself, international media star Piers Morgan. Hello to you, Piers.
I'll definitely take that description. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah. I mean, how do you define yourself? I mean, you're no longer with the MSM, but you are still a big media presence. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I just do a YouTube channel, but we have nearly 4.5 million subscribers. We have millions of views for all the content we put up. We focus on big, lively debates between smart people from both sides of pretty much every issue that the world is talking about, interspaced with big sit-down interviews with some of the most important figures from the worlds of politics or media or sport, whatever it may be. So we've hit, I think, a rich vein of a fast developing new way of consuming interviews and news and content of that nature. And right now we've got one of the biggest YouTube platforms in the world for it. So
I mean, is it basically that YouTube is just going to gobble up everybody else effectively?
Yeah. I mean, look, you can already see that. I think the latest figures showed that it's even outdoing the BBC now in the UK. In America, I think it's like 13-14% of television watchers who have a smart TV watch television through the YouTube app. Now, by comparison, only about 17-18% in America watch cable news through their TV, and about 23% watch broadcast news. So you can see the way the wind is blowing. It's blowing very, very fast. I just looked at my kids. My sons are 32 down to 25. My daughter's 14. None of them watch conventional mainstream television. None of them watch or disseminate any kind of regular mainstream media. They'll see clips on social media, but predominantly they watch YouTube and they watch the streamers. And it's just a generational thing, a bit like in music, when it suddenly went from vinyl to digital, in the way you're seeing with newspapers now, accelerating very fast from print newspapers to digital. It's purely generational. Nobody under 40 reads print newspapers, listens to vinyl records, or watches TV.
Is that a bad thing, though? I mean, obviously, no one will question the quality of your work, but
thank you.
There's a lot of rubbish out there, isn't there? And a lot of prejudice, which influencers and others are getting out. And I mean, it's a societal consequence that then the barrier's gone down, so there is no longer that professional shaping and scrutinising of the news, and that could lead us all into a very dangerous world, couldn't it?
It could, but I do think mainstream media globally has brought a lot of that on themselves. I mean, if you look at Trump, for example, who obviously I've known 20 years, and I've had good times and bad times with him. We fall out, we fall back in. He called me last week about my broken hip. We had a very nice, now recovering, and we had a very nice chat, but I can hammer him and then praise him depending on what I think the issue is. The problem is that if you look at the media in the US and UK, I would say 90% of the media coverage of Trump in his first term was very hostile. We're heading that way again now. And it's all very well, but it does suggest to people who are not already wedded to mainstream media that there's an inherent bias there. Why does the media have to show its bias in that manner? And it's fairly, to me, as somebody who tries to sit in the middle, consider myself pretty centrist, I think the bias is very clear and very obvious. And you saw it with the BBC mess they've got themselves into with Trump, where they deliberately, for reasons that completely baffle me, edited down one of the most infamous speeches in modern political history to convey a completely different impression of what Trump had said in the run-up to the January 6th riots. And inevitably, given what he's been doing with media companies in America, he's launched a massive lawsuit. And my guess is the BBC is going to have to settle this at a very high level and a very large amount of money, because they can't risk this going to Discovery, because if it goes to Discovery, it will surely, I suspect, and inevitably reveal that most BBC executives have an inherent anti-Trump bias. That is not what a taxpayer-funded BBC should be doing.
Well, I mean, hang on a second. I suspect, as a newspaper editor, or indeed still to this day, you sometimes abbreviate speeches. You can't give it a whole. And overall, I agree that it was journalistically unprofessional what the BBC did. Didn't really give a false impression of that speech.
Well, it did. No, I don't agree with that. I think it was a pretty egregious thing to do, actually, and I think it was.
No, I agree with you. It was wrong. I mean,
yeah, but it wasn't. I don't think it was a minor thing. What they were doing was saying they were trying to rewrite it so that it looked like over a 40, 50-minute speech, Trump had actually given a clear
weren't
directive.
they really in a documentary several years later trying to just give a flavour of it? I mean, that's...
Well, no, yeah, but the flavour they gave was completely misleading and goes to the whole point of Trump's defence, which is that he said his position, look, whether you agree with it or not, Trump's position has been very steadfast from that speech onwards, which is he never gave a directive to go and commit acts of violence. If you watch the way that Panorama edited that speech, it looked like he was giving an immediate clarion call, get down there and fight.
But do you believe he didn't effectively instigate what happened on January the 6th?
I think he has a lot of responsibility for what happened. I don't think he gave a clear directive for them to commit acts of violence, which is the way that edited clip showed. So I hammered him at the time for it. I thought it was an appalling stain on American democracy. It could have ended in an even worse way than it did, and it was completely unacceptable. And it was based on a completely false premise that he had that election stolen. He didn't. He lost it fair and square.
But, I mean, Trump, in a sense, goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, that he is the past master of getting messages out, making arguments which don't stand up to precise factual analysis. And indeed, he tells a lot of things which are not true. And yet, he managed to win the last election.
Well, he should be held to proper account.
But how can you do that?
Well, you just call out the stuff he says that isn't true by presenting factual evidence to the contrary, which is what I try to do with him. And look, in his first term, I wrote 120 columns about Trump for the Daily Mail online. And when he left office, I worked out that about 50% of them were positive and 50% were negative, which I would argue was a fairer representation, actually, of Trump's 4 years in power in America than the 100% negative that much of the mainstream media leveled at him, including the absurd Russia collusion obsession, which turned out largely to be untrue. And I think the trouble with going after Trump like that is, if you read his book, The Art of the Deal, back from the late 90s, early 2000s, the whole playbook is in there. And his whole modus operandi as a New York real estate magnate was, if you come under attack, you got to whack them back 10 times as hard. So it became a kind of abusive marriage between the mainstream media and Trump. This time round, I was hoping that both sides would have taken a little bit of a beat and worked out a better way to work with each other. To a degree, that's been achieved, but I still see a lot of the mainstream media now lapsing back into what I think is quite a lazy thing of just whack, 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 whack. Actually, you should be a little bit more judicious, collectively around the world, about what you go after Trump for and what you can concede where he's been successful. And I think you get a better Trump that way than the constant war of attrition that we see at the moment.
It's got to be said that in spite of his friendship with you and his concern, which we all share for your smashed hip. He hasn't been rushing to do an interview with you, has he?
No, I've not had one since we fell out over the last one, which was about 3 years ago. He keeps telling me he'll give me one, but I haven't actually hooked him in yet. But we talk quite regularly, and it's interesting. When he won this election, I rang him the next morning, and I said, "What's going to be different this time around?" He said, "Well, I've had 4 years to think about what happened in the first 4 years." And he said, "We're going to do things very differently. We've had 4 years to plan. We're going to hit the ground very hard. We're going to do a lot of stuff very quickly." He's got a better understanding of the pragmatic nature of American political system in the sense that he's got a ticking clock now to the midterms in November. It is highly likely that he will lose the House. The Republicans will lose the House in Congress. And at that moment, real paralysis kind of sets in. Your ability as a president to get bills passed pretty much recedes into almost impossible, and you become a lame duck president, whoever you are. And I think that Trump is aware of that, hence this kind of frenetic series of things that he's pushing to do, which, some of which I think have been very successful, some of which I think have been ridiculous. But the pace that he's doing stuff is consistent with somebody who in the first term felt very thwarted, and this time round is determined to try and get as much done as possible for his agenda before he potentially becomes a lame duck in November.
Okay, more from Piers Morgan in just a moment. You are listening to Sunday Morning with Adam Boulton here on Times Radio. Welcome back. I'm speaking to Piers Morgan, the transatlantic now media star. Now, you are complaining that you've been misquoted on social media with your views on the Epstein trials and the imprisonment of Ghislaine Maxwell. That's right?
Well, not just misquoted. They had a big piece in the Telegraph yesterday. I like the Telegraph. I read it every day. My wife works for it as a columnist. But I read this piece, and they'd asked me about the meeting I had with Ghislaine Maxwell at a book launch in, I think it was 2013, where I had a 5-minute conversation with her. I'd never met her. We talked exclusively about her father, Robert Maxwell, who, of course, had owned the Daily Mirror. And I never met any of the Maxwells, so I was curious to talk to her about her father for a few minutes. And they asked me about that. I said, look, as I wrote at the time in my diary for the Mail, I found her very charming, very friendly, very nice. I saw nothing of this incredibly dark, horrific, nefarious side to her that was clearly the reality of her relationship with Epstein. And then, to my astonishment and horror, the Telegraph then ran into another quote saying, I believe she's been made a scapegoat and shouldn't be in prison. And then they gave a damning last paragraph about how disgraceful this belief was of mine and what an insult it was to the survivors, which I would totally concur with had I ever said it. In fact, as they've now conceded in an apology that's online and will be in the paper on Monday, they didn't do it in the online version. They just did it in the print version. Anyway, to their credit, they have immediately thrown their hands up, conceded what happened, and apologised.
Right,
But the problem is that people will have read the paper and they will believe that's what I actually think, and they will have seen me be judged accordingly, which is a shame because it's obviously the opposite of what I think.
All right, but let's just clarify this. You think she deserves to be in prison?
100%, yeah. I mean, I've been hammering at Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein on my show now for years.
But yeah. It is possible that she's the scapegoat in the sense that very few of the powerful Americans associated with Epstein have faced many consequences.
Well, it does. I don't think it makes her a scapegoat. She's still just as culpable and guilty as she was indeed convicted of being culpable and guilty, of being effectively his fixer and madame, who was, I think, the direct conduit for so many of these young female victims to come under the clutches of Epstein, who was a convicted paedophile. So I'm very clear about her culpability and guilt. I certainly think it's extraordinary that whereas in the UK we're seeing some of the highest figures in public life from the royal family and from politics brought down by these ongoing revelations in the Epstein files, we're not seeing the same thing happening in America with high-profile people. You're seeing people on a kind of second tier who are losing jobs and stuff, but they're not really largely well known. But, there's no accountability at the level in America that we're seeing in the UK, and that has to change.
And there's still this interest in America in, hearing from former Prince Andrew, for example, in hearings. Would that serve any other purpose other than, media sensation?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly damaging to the monarchy and to the royal family. Incredibly damaging. You're now seeing that every time King Charles is out on a walkabout, or William has gone to Saudi Arabia, or Prince Edward obviously was over in the Middle East as well, all they're doing is either having people shout at them about the scandal or asking direct questions about the scandal. And I think the heat is building, and I don't think the conventional royal response of don't say very much and hope it blows over is going to wash this time. You've got Andrew, who is, I think he remains eighth in line to the throne, although obviously he'd never be king. But you have him still on that ladder. A very high-ranking member of the royal family at the centre of the biggest political and royal scandal of my lifetime. And the one thing Andrew has always said, he wanted to clear his name in court. And at the last minute in the action brought against him by Virginia Giuffre, he settled for a reported £12 million. And so he's never had his day in court. He's never cleared his name. More and more revelations have come out, including now about his behaviour as trade envoy, where he appears to have been leaking top secret information to business associates, including Epstein, in America. So he needs to get in front of the investigators in America and be interrogated under oath until they are satisfied that he's given them everything that they need to have. He also should be investigated by the British police, and indeed what was going on at Buckingham Palace with the comings and goings of these women, in the same way that Mandelson should also be, as he is being investigated by British police and in front of Congress in America. But, these are very serious figures in a very serious scandal who should be brought to book and put in front of people under oath who are investigating this scandal and be made to say what they actually know.
Do you think it would be better or worse for the king, for his brother to be exposed to the full force of the law on both sides of the Atlantic?
I think it would be better. It would clear the air once and for all about what Andrew did or didn't do. There's nothing more sobering for people than to be under oath with a penalty of perjury and years imprisonment if you lie. I think if you're King Charles, at the moment you're in a very, very difficult position where it looks like you're part of the cover-up. You are putting your brother up in, one of the royal estates in a very nice new, albeit not quite as luxurious home, but still very luxurious, with staff paying for you, and he's not doing a day's work. He's just having everything paid for him. And I don't think people like that. And I think that the king should order him to go and make himself available to all investigating authorities. I feel like the royal family are edging nearer to that position. But if they don't do that, there's always going to be this terrible stench of them being part of the cover-up, as indeed there is, very sadly, against his mother, the late great Queen, who obviously sanctioned the payment to pay off Virginia Giuffre. That looks more and more now like a poor error of judgment by the royal family and the monarchy as an institution, because we now know that a lot of what Virginia Giuffre was saying was true, not least the veracity of that picture of her with Andrew, which he's always denied, which we now know from emails in the Epstein files from Ghislaine Maxwell.
You have mentioned Peter Mandelson quite obviously for a number of reasons. Given what's been exposed in the Epstein files, you also, certainly when you were at the Daily Mirror, were quite close to New Labour back in the day. Where do you think the Labour Party and with it the Labour government is heading?
Well, I think it's very serious. And now you have a situation where, to me, the most problematic and damning moment of Keir Starmer's prime ministerial rule came in that dramatic moment in the Commons, in PMQs, when he finally admitted that before he appointed Mandelson as the UK ambassador to Washington, he had been told that Mandelson had continued his relationship with Epstein post-Epstein's conviction. And at that point, it becomes a matter of the Prime Minister's judgment. And it's not just about this. This is the kind of gruesome icing on the cake, if you like, of a guy in Keir Starmer who won a thumping majority and has tossed it away within 18 months with one of the most cack-handed tenures as Prime Minister imaginable. You come in with a huge majority after years of pretty disastrous Conservative rule. You don't seem to have a plan. Every policy you execute, you then do U-turns on, and we are where we are with the most U-turns I can imagine that any prime minister's made in the first 18 months. And he's gone after pensioners, he's gone after farmers, he's gone after pubs, he's gone after the absolute fabric of British society, which has made him, now in the polling, the most unpopular British prime minister I think there's ever been.
But give it,
I think, look, honestly, I think he's a dead man walking politically, whether he goes imminently or after the by-election, which I'm sure Labour will get a big beating in, or the May local elections. He's a dead man walking, and everyone, I think, in politics knows it.
But would it help, after the turmoil that we had under the Conservatives, would it help just to toss out another prime minister?
Well, I don't think the excuse for not getting rid of a leader or prime minister is that there's no one better to come along. What a damning indictment that is of the Labour Party collectively. If that is their collective position, then they should go to the country and have an election. I can't believe that is their position. I can't believe there aren't some senior players in the Labour Party that are going to make a move quite soon. Simply, there's no one better out there. It's not a good enough reason to keep a terminally damaged prime minister. The country is owed better than that.
Yeah, but would the country be better off to have, more uncertainty, or would it be better off to have Nigel Farage or, Angela Rayner?
Or Kemi Badenoch, who I think has gathered a lot of momentum and gone from being somebody I didn't think was up to leading the country to somebody that I think is
that an endorsement?
Well, it's not an endorsement, but I certainly think that she has been massively enhancing her reputation in the last year. And I think at the same rate, Keir Starmer's been destroying his. So I don't think it's a done deal that Reform would win an election. I think that you cannot rule out them. I think at some stage Reform and the Conservatives have to do a deal. The question then becomes who leads any kind of merged party. And I don't think it's a done deal. It would be Nigel Farage. I could easily see it being Kemi Badenoch. But, in relation to the Labour Party, they know, and we know, that Keir Starmer is terminally damaged. He's shown that he's not fit to be Prime Minister, either in terms of competence, in terms of all these U-turns, and in terms of his judgment over Mandelson.